Well, let me welcome everybody. Let me welcome everyone to the Future Trends Forum. I'm so glad to see so many people here this week. This is a very, very exciting session with some fantastic guests and some terrific reading. I'm really glad to welcome all of you here. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your host, the chief cat herder for this hour, and the creator of the Future Trends Forum. Let me begin by explaining it and telling you about how the forum works and where it came from. So first of all, you should know the forum is a discussion-based space. This is a place for conversation about the exploration of the future of education and technology. Now, it's spun out of another project called the Future Trends in Technology and Education Report. And that's a monthly trends analysis that takes a look at the major trends reshaping education and technology. That includes domains as different as technology, pedagogy, enrollment, along with demographics and economics. If you haven't seen it before, go to ftte.us. You can download some sample copies and subscribe yourself or your institution as you like. Now, that's a publication that's oriented at broadcasting information. What we do here is converse. Now, both of these projects, both the FTTE report and the Future Trends Forum, are part of a broader project called the Future of Education Observatory. And that's an ongoing multimedia participatory and open conversation seeking to better understand where education and technology are headed. If you haven't seen that, just go to futureofeducation.us and you can find links there to the FTT report, to this forum, as well as to our blog, our bookstore, and to our online book club, as well as more things coming up. So go to futureofeducation.us to learn more. Now, I want to thank people who helped make all this possible before we proceed further. And I want to start off by thanking NYSERNet from New York State. Now, that's a nonprofit organization that helps that state's colleges, universities, and other organizations get online and do terrific things through networks. It's a fantastic group. I really recommend them, and I'm very, very grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful for Shindig's support. Shindig makes available the technology that we're using right now. So let me just take a minute to walk you through it in case you haven't seen it before. Now, it works in some ways like video conferences you might be familiar with, but it differs in some other key ways. For example, where I am right now, and where these slides are just for a minute, is called the stage. It's called that because this is the spot where everybody involved in this video conference can see and hear everything that goes on up here, like a stage in an auditorium or in a big classroom. And this is where our guests are going to be in just a couple of minutes. And this is where you can join us, and I'll show you how to do that. Now, right below us, if you look around, you'll see dozens of icons of individuals and small groups of people. Some of them will be video feeds, some of them will be static pictures, but each of those represents at least one person signed on to this forum right now from somewhere in the world. You'll see as we go, they move back and forth a little bit like a live crowd, which is what they represent. If you'd like to communicate privately with one of those other people, simply double-click on them. And if they'd like to speak with you and their technology is working, your two icons will snap together like Lego bricks and you could have your own private audiovisual conversation, which is pretty neat. But I said this is about conversation, and let me show you some other ways that can work. Look towards the bottom of the screen. Running along it is a white strip that has a whole series of different icons. Each represents a different tool you can use for raising questions and sharing your thoughts. So on the left edge, you'll see a number. I think it says 79 right now. And if you click on that, up will pop two little windows. The one on the left will give you a kind of film strip view of everybody who's here. So you can mouse over each individual person and get a little bit more information about who they are and what they do. And to the right of that is a text chat box. And that lets you have informal, quick text conversations with the more or less 20 or so people who have signed in with you. And those conversations are pretty handy for informal questions, answers, for floating ideas. People often use them for sharing links to resources that have come up during our conversation. That's a good place to bash out ideas among the 20 or so people who've logged in with you. Now, back to that white strip. Next to the button, which now says 81 people, next to that, you'll see a question mark with a circle around it. If you click that, you can type in a question or a comment that you would like us to raise. It's really easy. Click it, type it, hit send, and I'll get that. And when the time is right, I'll float it up on the screen so everyone can see it, and I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear it. Now, even better than those two buttons, next to those in the white strip, you'll see a raised hand button with a circle around it. Click that, and that tells us you want to join us on stage. How do you do that? simple. If your microphone and camera are working and you're in a space like I am right now where you can speak freely out loud, click that, and that'll tell us you want to join us on stage. When the time is right, we'll beam you on stage, and you'll be here alongside myself and our guests. It's really easy to do. We'll show you how to do it and how it works in just a couple of minutes. We're the first one to do it, but it's a really nice way to maximize the affordances of video conferencing technology. If that's not enough, you can go to another tab or another browser, or another computer, and go over to Twitter and use the hashtag FTTE. And there, you can raise more questions and ask more comments, or ask questions and raise comments as you like. We'll be checking that as we go. So, those are many, many venues for you to share your thoughts as we go. Again, this is a discussion-based place, and we're very, very grateful to Shindig for making available the technology that makes it work. Lastly, but definitely not leastly, we are very grateful to our supporters on Patreon. Now, Patreon is a crowdfunding site that lets you support someone who's doing creative work or producing a project that you support. In this case, it's our project here of trying to understand the future of education and technology. So if you go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander, you'll see different ways you can support by contributing as little as $1 a month to keep all the lights on and the machines humming. In fact, right now, you could take a look at this screen and you can see that there are dozens, from more than 100 people who are supporting us. Wonderful folks like Michael Haggins, Bob Johnson, Corey S., Chris Lott, Colleen Carr, and we're really, really grateful to them for their support. So that's who supports the forum. That's how the technology works. Now you understand its purpose and how it works. Let's get to today's session. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome two fantastic people. First, I want to mention John Seeley Brown, JSB, who is a legend in the field of education and technology. He's currently the independent co-chair of the Deloitte Center for Edge Innovation and a senior fellow at the Annenberg Center for Communication at USC. How he does all this at the same time, I don't know. Speaking of multitasking geniuses, I also want to introduce Pendleton-Jullian. She is a fellow at Stanford Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, as well as across the country being a professor at the Knowlton School of Architecture at Ohio State University, and a distinguished visiting professor of design at Georgetown University, and also the Pardee Rand Graduate School of Public Policy. The two of them somehow have found the time to write two groundbreaking books on design and where education can be taking it. We're very, very excited to have them here to explain their thinking, to share their books, and to tell us where they think all of education is going, what the possibilities are. So to begin with, I'm just going to welcome the first one here. Let's see if I can bring up John Seeley Brown. So. There's always this moment of suspense. Will he come up? Hello, John. We have to connect the infrastructure across the country and see if this is snapping too. John, can you see or hear us? This may take a couple of seconds. Hello, John. Can you see us and hear us?
I can do that, but you can't seem to see or hear me too well.
Actually, I can perfectly right now. Welcome.
Oh, very, very good. Okay. It takes a long time to get across the country.
It can, and your wings are so tired. Well, John, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you taking the time to meet with the forum. Where are you today? Where have we found you?
I'm in Palo Alto, California right now.
Oh, very good. And I'm sure the weather is very stressful and horrible.
Well, it was so bad last night that they canceled 250 planes trying to land at San Francisco Airport. So, yes, we're having bad weather everywhere.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, they could perhaps take a train to LA. No, they can't do that.
Yeah, nope, that takes slightly longer, but yes.
Well, I hope you stay safe and reasonably dry. I just quickly introduced you by naming your titles and mentioning your legendary status. If I could ask you to instead just tell us What are you going to be working on for the rest of calendar 2019? What's uppermost in your mind and most likely to take up most of your time?
Well, what I really want to do is set the stage a little bit, and then get Anne to come up, because I think from my point of view, we're now at a critical moment in work that we've been doing for the last 3 years. This book that we've just come out with is actually Design Unbound, Designing for Emergence in a Whitewater World. Um, and so it has much more to do with the world as we are now experiencing it in the 21st century, which is,
Mm,
needless to say, challenging many of our classical notions of how learning is done, how education needs to be done, and so on and so forth, because we're finding ourselves in a world in which the half-life of many skills is 5 years. And
mm,
basically, we're constantly being, in my point of view, we're always a newbie. That's to say,
mm,
everything
mm,
we're experiencing is we are amateurs at something, and we're expecting to feel good about learning how to do something,
mhm,
because
mhm.
stuff is always changing. I just wrote off of the Amazon board, but I was overseeing a lot of the work on the board, that is, in terms of the AWS, the cloud service system, and to dramatize how much change there is. Almost every single morning, I would wake up to find three fundamentally new services on that cloud. Uh,
Wow.
and not three a month, but three every day.
And
That means
you
there's
don't mean three new customers. You mean three new functions for AWS.
function, substantial functions.
Mm,
Okay, and so this is kind of like the speed at which innovation is happening. But what does it mean to be able to be in that kind of world in which you can view it more as an adventure rather than something that causes you to scream? So, so both Ann and I have been looking much more at kind of the sense of being in a whitewater world, kind of like being like in a whitewater kayaker going down the rapids, and how that now is so much more common to the experiences many of us feel today. But let me get to the real point, because I really want to get Ann up here. Um, about 3 years ago, um, I was at Rand. I'm on the board of the party graduate school at Rand, and it's very clear that not only is the world as we typically explore it changing all the time, but this is an incredible challenge for public policy, um, because basically technology is changing everything, and how do you regulate that? And we're in a kind of a hyper-connected world now. Anything happening almost anywhere in the world starts to influence us, so on and so forth. This suggests we got to really rethink, how do we train people to be effective in public policy circles.
mm,
And,
mm,
and so that led me to bring Anne in to do a key strategic talk for them. And that started a major process going on in terms of reimagining what a PhD program in public policy could or maybe should be like, for the properties of a world that is radically contingent, hyper-connected, and constantly changing. The three things that public policy is terrible at handling. So let's bring Ann up, and then and let's bring Ann up, and let's get her to tell a little bit about this.
Oh, that's well set up. That's well said. Let's see. And can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you see and hear me?
Oh, yes, we
Yes.
can.
Yay.
Beautifully.
Good. Good.
Welcome.
Thank
Welcome.
you.
So glad to see you.
Thank you.
And so I asked John what he was thinking about and what he's going to be working on for the next year. And he modestly described the rest of the 21st century. Um, and then he set this up for you and for your work together. So let me give you the shot at the same question. Looking ahead to the rest of calendar 2019, what's going to be taking up most of your time and most of your thought?
So you kind of made a joke about all of the universities that I'm attached to, and
Oh,
um, these aren't just a list for prestige. These are actually universities that I'm working with in different capacities. I myself have been, I'm an architect by training, a practicing architect. I make buildings and more than buildings now. And so I was actually brought on as dean at Ohio State for several years with the intention to see if I could transform or update the education as it was being dealt with here. It was quite an education for me in terms of learning about leadership and how you do that. And when I stepped down, and I wrote a first series of papers on some new models for education, but they were more strategic or tactical than strategic. And when I stepped down, the president of Georgetown University asked me to go there and hang out. I hung out for about 2 months. I said, I got to do something. And we started creating a first studio, which was the first humanities studio ever. And we took on designing a new model for the university in the future, so 2033. From that, it rolled into a series of other humanities, radically multidisciplinary studios in a few universities that were really taking on wicked problems. And the difference, and then that led into Rand, which has now become a 4-year endeavor. So my year will be, we've really picked up speed. We've got quite a bit of momentum at Rand. As John said, there was a real imperative for them to change because they recognize that policy is no longer just top down, that we have a whole different power moves differently, influence moves differently. They recognize that technology is changing everything. And it's not just the applications and how you would use big data, but it's the implications of policy, implications. So for making new policy. And then that Rand has been very successful at working in projects from a reductionist perspective. And so the idea here was to bring complexity science as the major overlay to this. And then the fourth kind of imperative is that the nature of knowledge is changing how we access it, how we work with it, how we sort through it. And so that led to a 9-month process with 160 people at Rand, creating a very audacious reimagining of the program. Phase 2 took us into actually creating concrete systems of different actions and mechanisms to integrate and achieve that. And then before we even finished that, I said, okay, we're going to prototype some studios. We're going to prototype a lab. We started prototyping and we're learning. We're now in our 2nd year of mandatory studios that are working on things like, which is the core of the kind of transformation. And there are many other parts to it. We took on homelessness in LA County last year. And when we presented at the end to experts working in this area, they said we'd really broken the box. We'd really, that they meant that in a good way, not in a bad way, that we'd introduced several things that were not part of even the really good work that's happening. LA's absolutely committed to this, but they're not looking at systems and all that. So anyway, so that's kind of where my work lies. In addition, because the book is published with John, which has been a book that's tried to generalize the work we've done that's been successful, and then see if we can bring it out to other people to try working with these things as well. And the really different perspective is that it's really about, it's design unbound from disciplinary boundaries and from things. It's this kind of, it's a marriage of complexity science and architectural practice, which by nature is radically multidisciplinary, by nature is about contexts. Complexity science gives us new lenses, new principles, new tools, which I'm also drawing on from Rand. So we're trying to, in action, build a new practice. And that's what's really gotten us exciting. And that's, so all of our work is doing a bunch of stuff that's trying to feed that kind of new practice in action, if you will.
Oh, that's tremendous. And let me just make sure I have the title of the book, Design Unbound, Designing for Emergence in a Whitewater World. There's 2 volumes, Designing for Emergence, and the other one is?
Ecologies of Action.
Ecologies of Action, available from MIT Press or, of course, from the Future Trends bookshop. Before we go further and I start interrogating you about this book, let me just welcome the 100 or so people who are in on this video conference. If you would like to ask questions or make comments, this is the time when that starts. So again, you can go back to that white bar at the bottom of the screen. And if you would like to ask a question by video, just click the raised hand button. If you'd like to, if your video camera doesn't work, or if you're not in a spot to ask questions, I understand, just hit the raised hand button, type in a question or a comment. Already we have conversation going on Twitter, so I'm glad to see that. And in fact, we have our first question before I even finish asking for questions. We have Ray Garcelon from Arizona State University. So let me bring him up right now.
We love Arizona State.
Indeed.
We love Arizona State.
Ray, how are you doing? Again, we're stretching the infrastructure of the entire planet to its uttermost right now. Let's see. This may take a second here. Ray, we can see you, but you don't seem to be moving, so you might want to retry your connection.
No, see, it's trying to connect.
We'll give him one more second here.
I think the rain just slowed everything down. Oh, there you go.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Hello, Ray. Yes, you are. Welcome. Good to see you.
Yes, thanks again, as always, bring me up. I put my question in, and Brian knows me, and Shindig knows me, so they bring me up. I don't know. In life, I haven't always been such a front row person. But my question today is not something that usually I'll look up during the week, because Brian provides us with the speakers. This is something that I've really emerged through as an instructional designer, formal faculty member. And I think it's related to our speakers. This is something, and I don't know if you can see my kind of statement question. This is a lot of questions with a lot of answers. But really, I saw some YouTube videos of our speakers, and they're bringing up the HoloLens. But there just really seems to be a widening gap between faculty digital fluency. Not that it's not moving forward, but it's not keeping up with not consumption or ability to make something pedagogically, but really, as instructors, as even if facilitators, their ability to use tools to create something that's pedagogically sound. So the gist of my question is, in the question part of it, to our designers, what do you think needs to be redesigned in terms of, and about the whitewater, the 5-year changing, which is a good amount of time for learning. Ultimately, we're trying to make learning better for everyone, call them students, learners, but the creators, the faculty, the facilitators, it seems like they're really falling behind in their ability to be digitally fluent designers, creators. So do you have, in that frame, hopefully that's a pretty good frame, what can be done in this area of creators of digital learning that's not PowerPoint bullets or just some tool they learned how to use that's kind of neat and has a novelty?
So faculty and support staff development. That's a great question, Ray. Thank you.
But maybe not,
Anne or John, do you want to give
an answer?
Do you want to?
I'll let Anne start. Let Anne start. But by the way, a part of the answer is you happen to have down at ASU a president who profoundly understands this kind of challenge. And so both Anne and I hold Michael in the highest regard, come down periodically to examine some of the new changes on your multiple campuses, how you have really restructured learning in very interesting ways. But let me turn this back to Anne, and because she's thought a lot about this, and I'll come in at the end. Yeah.
So I think there's two aspects to it. One has to do with culture, but one has to do with the design brief, if you will. So when I started working at Georgetown with a small group of people called Candles, Center for something, whatever.
New Designs in Learning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Candles is so much easier. Anyways, so I was working there with my dear friend whose name
Randy.
Randy Bath. And it was a small organization that was an edge organization that was a nice thing to do that they'd gotten money for. And I am coming directly to your question, but what we set out to do, which was we created a series of studios with which was looking at the new model of the university in the future. From there, Jack implemented the redesign of the futures of Georgetown University. The reason I bring that up is because all of a sudden we were aiming at something. It wasn't an abstract question of how do I use technology to teach better. I learn new technology when I need it for purpose. What this initiative did is it created a warranted purpose by the head of the university, which certainly Michael Crow does. Then it even created the structure and the mechanism in which to do it. Randy became vice provost. We created the Red House, and we were often running where faculty would come in because they had something they wanted to do, whether it was a multidisciplinary project they needed new tools for, or they wanted to be able to video conference across the world, or the head of the bioethics lab that I worked with to build the bioethics lab decided she wanted to get her first course online because the case studies would create. So the whole notion of it's hard to speak in the abstract until someone has something they want to do and a reason to do it. And then you have a really good place they can go to that knows the different things you can do, right? What's already out there that you just repurpose. And that same person can say, well, it's not out there, so let's go look at something new. So it's really three things, I think. The real desire and wanting to and reason to, and you can't make people have reasons. These are intrinsic. A place they can easily go to and feel that they won't be asking stupid questions. And then that place has to be really up on what's out there, can be done, and is a person who's created a network of peers to support each other. And you need that ecosystem, I think.
That's a fantastic answer. A really detailed answer. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
John, do you want to pounce on that, or?
Well, I mean, I think also, it's so easy to talk about the importance of interdisciplinarity or interdisciplinary work today, which is going to be key because wicked problems resist reductionism. And so one has to be willing to unentangle or disentangle connections. In the old days, we would define a problem to fit inside a box. And anything that didn't fit in that box, we called an externality. And we pushed everything outside of the box so we could just make sure we could solve and optimize the problem in the box. But that doesn't do much to honor the entanglements inherent in complex problems, which we hope universities are preparing our graduates to be able to handle. And so I think the one twist that I see coming out of the studios that Anne has been building and getting to actually experience some of them in there with her is a sense that a key property here is how do students and how do faculty, maybe even more importantly, become skilled at a kind of deep listening that is both generous, so you can listen across disciplinary boundaries, but also generative. Generative is I can take an idea across that silo, and now I play with it in my own head relative to my space, and can add texture to it. And so it's a sense that, how do you actually open up your listening generously, but more importantly and more nuanced, how do I take those ideas and entangle them with my own thinking, my own biases, or my own field to figure out where to go? And if faculty have to do that, but the kinds of inquiry type studios that Anne builds really get students with each other also, and with the outside experts they bring in to the studios, really more skilled at this property. And to me, this is a key property of thriving, if not even flourishing, for the problems we're finding in the 21st century.
That's a great answer from another angle. Thank you, John.
Two things, if I could just say on that. Two things I should say would be that a lot of people are aware of. I have been at ASU for about 5 months, but I've been at 4 other universities in the last 6 or 7 years. So this isn't, and so I can't speak, in terms of what ASU is able to do. But I have been here now long enough to know this issue. And this question, I think, is as much to our esteemed speakers as to the over 100 today, many of who are instructional designers working with faculty. It's as much to that milieu of instructional designers out there in the crowd. And I think it is a very pressing issue that it needs resolution. And I guess the best you can do here is bring it up.
And you did that well. Thank you, Ray. Thank you. We have a stack of people who are asking questions. I need to get them in before, and I don't get to ask any of my questions, which is perfect.
Nope.
Let me bring in my old friend Mark Prensky. Mark, let's see if the connection works.
It should work.
How are you doing? We need to use the Star Trek transporter noise. That's what I'm gonna get next time.
Right.
Let's see if he's still coming up. And okay, give one more second here. Mark.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. I am here in Palo Alto along with John and Anne. Are you in Palo Alto as well?
No, I'm in.
Oh well, someday you will be. I have a lot of questions. First, I'm very excited about what you're doing and the ways you're thinking about this. The first question I had, and you may have partially answered that. I tried to listen deeply, John, and maybe you have answered this. When we last spoke, I remember vividly you're having a very strong reaction to what they call design thinking. Maybe it's the kind, that represents the D School at Stanford or IDEO or all those places. And I wondered, given what you're doing, whether that's true, whether you do have concerns about it, whether they're reductionism or anything else. That was the word I heard, and what those might be.
Well, let me briefly answer it, and also turn it back to Anne. Design thinking in a very interesting way. Notice that design predicates thinking. So the emphasis is thinking in a curious sort of way. Design thinking has been incredibly useful for the corporate world that has lost the ability to do very much innovation, and has really profited from the templates that design thinking has created to give courage to people to break out of their own box, to maybe actually be able to listen to customers in new ways, albeit in simple ways, but and then to rapidly prototype something. Right. So it's it's had a tremendous impact in the corporate world. I think here we're talking about things that are much more fundamental, in terms of the kinds of wicked problems that our society is facing, that really are high, the issues are incredibly entangled. Whereas, many of the things we do with public policy, for example, creates more problems than they solve, because the entanglement turned out to be the dominant factor. So what we're really stepping back is saying, no, let's go back and try to honor the much more nuanced probing of situations that really good, architectural designers do. And so let me turn it over to you, Anne.
Please.
Yeah. No, I'm totally in agreement. I think that design thinking, when it was born for all the right reasons and from all the right places. You know, putting engineering and business coming together because the business world felt they could not get real value out of their creatives. And so you had the engineers coming over saying, this is how we understand creativity in our domain, which is engineering, which is very much about often, you set out the problem, you optimize, you iterate, you prototype. And so it was a really very useful relationship and has done a lot of amazing work. The difference is that the work there does not work on systems, complex emergent systems and human systems, material systems, even let's call them cultural or systems of thinking, right? So the thing that what we've been able to do to finally, it took forever, to try to articulate what we're doing, which is this blend between complexity science and architecture. And each of them brings something very important. The complexity science really gives us a new lens to look at the world where everything's attached. Think ecosystems, right? Everything's attached. Nothing, you can't take a piece out without it. You don't even know what the repercussions are going to be. So that's when I say complex systems, that's the kind of what I mean by complex systems. So you get principles from that, just as Darwinism brought us principles and Newton brought us principles. These are principles. You get new concepts like the idea of different clocks, the idea of resilience. These are not just fluffy bunny ideas. These have deep science behind them, and we can see how that's analogous for human systems. And then the third thing is it brings together a whole series of tools. We use causal inference diagrams, for instance. What architecture brings, again, rigorously, is that the practice has by nature been about radically multidisciplinary. As an architect, we do buildings, but buildings are contexts for the messiness of human life. And there are architects who are really all about the thing and how the thing they design makes them happy. But the way I was trained was about how do you really unpack the context, the tangibles, the building heights, the building styles, the weather, whatever, all of the intangibles and the intangibles of context. To do that, you have to be more than just a thing maker. And you aren't reductionist, you're just curiosity. You're like Sherlock Holmes. What is this in this context? Why do people act this way? And then for me, a successful building begins to either insert itself into that context for really good usefulness, or a lot of my work as an architect will say, how can we create new contexts that are containers for new possibilities? So I did a university in Bangladesh, and it wasn't about, we did a whole new pedagogical structure. We did a whole new way of thinking about it because we needed to create a possibility that didn't exist in any conventional university. As a context, a physical context, but a system as well, dealing with networks and people and funding and the environment. We can't leave out the environment. So by nature, architects radically multidisciplinary. By nature, it is about context. And so we know how to talk multiple disciplines. And we have a series of affordances because you can't work in a radically multidisciplinary way unless you use like information visually very rigorously to communicate. So it is really about contexts, not things that are well adapted to users, but context and context for new possibilities. And it is very much about the affordances along with that and the radically multidisciplinary way to look at it. Did that answer it?
Thank you. That goes a long way to start it. And as soon as you thought that, what went through my mind was, gee, the World Trade Center was not designed for a context of fully loaded planes, flying into it. That was so it was built in a certain way and it collapsed. But so what I recently went back to Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And I thought, and it was enormously useful read in terms of the future of education and thinking about that. I wrote a paper on it, which if you haven't seen, I'm happy to share. But what he essentially said was that when the context changes, essentially, you have to put on new lenses, and you've already used those very words. So what I guess what I would love to hear, if you have them, and maybe I've heard this already, what are the essence, what is the essence, if you will, of the new lenses that people have to wear? I've heard emergence, I've heard complexity, I've heard context. What, in other words, when you go to somebody and you say, if you do this, you're old, and if you put on these lenses, you are now seeing it you are now working in the new paradigm. And the other point that he makes, I thought that was really fascinating, is that the two paradigms are almost always incompatible, that you can't see both at once, like the diagram of the faces in the vase. And it's very hard to do both at once. So
I disagree.
Okay, well, good.
There you go.
No, it's like we hired you as a setup here, right?
Hey, I'm cheap. I come cheap.
I wouldn't say that.
This is the second chapter of our book. The first chapter is a story that tries to put you in the right mindset. The second chapter is about this, and we're very clear that and then I do want John to also add his to this, because we see this a little differently. That that Newton gave us a phenomenal window on the world, a world view that is still valuable today. His 3 laws still work. But
in a context.
In a context, they still work. An apple still falls in my house. I don't know about in your house. I don't think that changes context to context, right? Maybe when we go to Mars, it's different, but it is different. But anyways, the point being that then what happened is he couldn't do enough, and Darwin comes along. Darwin gave us a second window on the world. Darwin showed us about process. Darwin showed us about kind of the intrinsic rule sets. But there are things Darwin also, as a worldview, it doesn't deal with novelty. It doesn't deal with radical innovation. It was very much at the level of the cell and the individual biology. He didn't really deal with the systems between them. So complexity science came on the scene as a very interesting phenomenon because it was never one science. It came from the fact that biology, all these different sciences had things happening they couldn't explain, put them on the shelves. All of a sudden we have computation, we have feedback, we have cybernetics, and we begin to understand maybe we can look at these phenomena differently. The problems came off the shelf, and complexity science begins to grow out of this phenomenon. One of the strands of it is potentially more productive than the others, which is the ecology theory strand. So what we are saying is that we really need a third window on the world. And that window, let's call it ecology. Let's call it a complexity science through ecology, thinking ecology. And our point is absolutely you need all 3. And they have to work together. Darwin still is right, and Newton is right. But here's a third one that we were missing. And this one allows the others to coexist at the same time. And we have to work that way. And then all of the tools come off of that kind of principles and the thinking that comes with it. But John, you should also,
Well, let me also add that if you shift to thinking about ecologies, you start thinking about sets of exchanges.
Yeah.
And you start to look at sets of exchanges that where you start looking at the feedback structures of those exchanges and so on and so forth. We tend to knock that out of most of our models. And I think that you start thinking about, how do things become autocatalytically self-supporting, or kind of we call autocatalytic mutualisms. And that brings it helps you understand why emergence really does happen, but it also gets you to start thinking about, in university context and political context, what are the propensities of that context? And in fact, as you will see kind of in the end of our book, we try to bring in Asian thinking as much as Western thinking, having to do with how do you really think about what are the propensities of contexts and how do you work with them If you're really trying to design for emergence, that has something to do with working with their propensities.
But there's one thing we need to throw in the mix here, because it's really critical, and I don't want us to forget it, which is that it's one thing if you can say, here are 3 laws and they work. It's another thing if you're looking at systems and the exchanges between things, some information you can know, and you can get it through science. Some things you have to use a much more abductive kind of logic, where you're asking, what could it be? So to go after unintended consequences and unforeseen things, you have to say, what could it be? The World Trade Center is such a great problem. You know, there are people that were saying, what if a terrorist wanted to do X? Here's a way to do it. The notion that the imagination in a rigorous way, not just fluffy bunny, whatever. And we talk about that in the 19th chapter. We have a book. The imagination becomes a critical partner, a critical muscle in abductive logic. Think Sherlock Holmes, you know, where he'd go, oh, there's 7 possible crazy things this could be. This is the crux of where one often works on these complex problems.
Thank you. I look forward to downloading and reading the book on my iPhone, and I hope we can have future conversations, and I cede the time to all the others. Thank you very much. This was terrifically useful.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for fantastic answers. I have no time to pounce and add my own follow-ups, because we have more people who are lined up, starting with Carl Hakkarainen. Hello.
Hi there. Thanks for this forum. Thank you, John and Ann, and of course, Brian. I hope your escape from New England winters is going well.
Almost.
Almost. So my question comes from observations that Brian has been making regarding the state of particularly small liberal arts colleges. I'm seeing a transformation from the traditional liberal arts to much more professional development, and with that, a much more conservative, lowercase c conservative view of what is safe. In many cases, these institutions are facing real survival threats. We're watching one of the most innovative colleges around, Hampshire College, on its way down. We're seeing other small colleges closing abruptly. So I'm based in Massachusetts, and our Attorney General has been putting forward some policies to control those shutdowns. But what is happening is that institutions are becoming fearful. And with that, they're heading for the shore rather than riding the whitewater raft down the river. And getting somebody to pivot from fear and from traditional, what they learned in their graduate school 30 years ago, to forward thinking and preparing the students for a world that doesn't exist yet, it's almost too far for many to go. That said, how are you dealing with that when you encounter that?
The question of the liberal arts to the vocational learning.
John,
I mean, I have an unusual take, and then Ann has even a more unusual one. But in fact, I was giving a micro talk yesterday at a whole different at the Aspen gathering last night, night before last. I'm constantly being asked, being a past guru or current guru from Silicon Valley, by parents, what should I get my daughter and son to do? Should they actually go directly to data science, or should they actually just do computation, or ... And my response is, what I would do? I think the most successful kind of place for profession to study is actually think about becoming a historian. And they, of course, practically fall over at that.
Yeah.
And I said, but here's why. If you think about what research historians do, they are trained to deconstruct, to uncompile incredibly complicated contexts. And the ability to understand how to work with and probe and understand the inner forces of a particular context is what research historians do. Now, that also is probably the answer to how do we deal with fake news. It has an awful lot to do with when we begin to realize they're both slow and fast variables that are driving our complex systems that we're living in today. And I just think that this sense of a new type of literacy is being called for. And it's kind of a literacy of understanding how interlocking different timescales play out with each other, what these complex feedback structures can really do, what propensities really mean. This is all part of history. I mean, good research historians know this stuff. And I think that it's a fantastic opportunity to reinvent what is a new type of literacy, and I think it's incredibly exciting and incredibly useful. But let me
just as a footnote to that, and I got a chance to hear Jill Lepore speak a couple of weeks ago about her new book on these truths, and very many of these same themes come through in her talk and in her writing.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Carl.
Yeah,
and go ahead.
So the advocacy is a really big part of it, and advocacy with people who are being listened to. I think that's critical. I think what I learned when I was a leader is how bad a leader I started out to be, because I wanted to work with people and get the consensus and move forward. Since I've now been working on projects that have had success, I'm finding that creating models or things that have success, then other people are willing. So about 10% of the world is always out front and willing to take risk. Then there's a whole bunch that will never go anywhere. And then there's some that will never go anywhere. And then there's a whole bunch in between who are less risk takers, but it doesn't mean they don't want. And so when people begin to see things that are successful, Michael Crow took a lot of hits for 10 years, but now there's success that other people are looking to. So there's success at a large scale, whole institution level, like RAND is, PRGS now is getting some recognition. But in a university, I'm at Ohio State part of the time, if the university isn't doing that, I think even as individuals, especially those of us that are older than the younger faculty, that are full faculty, it's the same thing, doing things without incurring too much wrath or even attention until there's success in them, that mentors others that don't have, protects the kind of fledglings that are taking risks. And we have to create things that find people and create things that have success. I'm working with a group here now. There's about 6 people that have found each other. They're all like, "Oh, you do complexity science?" But it's not about us screaming and saying, "Listen to us." We have to do something real first and build some success.
Thank you, Carl. And just to let you know, and I have very carefully resisted mentioning your Ohio State work. As a person with 3 degrees from the University of Michigan, that's a serious effort.
I love Michigan. We love Michigan.
There you go. Just from Twitter, we had a couple of observations from people. Monica Hardy wondering about what it would be like for policymakers to let go of policy-ness. And we had another comment from Lear Lobo. She wants to praise design thinking for giving people the courage to break out of the box. We also have, and I'm conscious of time, we're almost out of time. We have a question here. This is from the awesome Phil Long, previous guest on the program, and a great scholar. And Phil asks, a trend growing is for educational institutions to respond more directly to the perceived proximate requirements of business skills. Developing interdisciplinary thinking versus training is the challenge. That's not a question. That's a statement for you all.
So, hi, Philip. I completely agree with where your sensibility lies. I really think that first of all, business skills are changing faster than ever.
Yeah.
People keep talking about reskilling the corporate world, which is, of course, what I do when I'm at Deloitte. And our whole point, my whole point in our little center there is no, you don't reskill. You actually create frameworks for people to constantly be reskilling themselves. And in fact, we could have even opened up this thing about, study groups turning out to be at the university level. One of the most fantastic ways for kids to pick up the skills to be able to learn with and from each other. Because we learn collaboratively in action. That is the exact opposite of corporate training.
Yes.
Okay, and so the game here is how do you actually learn? I'm obviously situated learning. What else would I say? But honoring situated learning in action, where multiple people can look at and work with each other to be able to have multiple perspectives on what you just did right and what you did wrong. How do you can you form a collaborative learning? And I think that you don't learn in a box. And I just think that you learn in action. And I just think in some sense, universities, the real job of universities is to cultivate, not to teach. Okay, and it's, you are embedded in a fantastic space where you're constantly hearing new ideas. You're rubbing up against different disciplines.
Right.
And you engage in really, interesting projects, however you want to look at it. But I just think that, I think we have to be prepared. It's, of course, it's a throwaway line to say we want to become lifelong learners, but the real game is how do we learn in action with each other?
Then that's a great answer, a great response to Phil's typically deep and thoughtful question. We have a couple more coming in, and we're down to our last couple of minutes. Please go ahead, Anne.
Which is, so one thing that's really interesting is I think we also have to really reconceive the relationship between student and teacher. It's always been teacher teaching or creating frameworks for learning. In my field, in a 5-year BArch, by the time a student graduates, they've actually had to pick up 2 or 3 new technologies along the way. I can't do that as quickly, not because I don't have interest, but because I also have research agendas around things like precarious settlements and cities and whatever. So I, as an older person, am dealing with content and all of a bunch of other stuff. So we need to use, I use the students all the time to teach me, to come in. I can't do what they can do, but I get exposure as they pick it up. We have to recraft. The students have to develop the skill of agility. We have to develop the skill of eavesdropping on their agility and being able
eavesdropping on agility. That's a great phrase. And greetings to the students who are in on this video conference right now, including Sasha Deng. We have Anne. Could I direct one last question to you?
Yeah.
This is actually from a mutual friend of ours, Eddie Maloney, who wants to know, back to the campus environment, how can you help teach people to help faculty work with students as entrepreneurial learners? I mean, in a sense, we've talked before, you gave us a beautiful description of how we can reshape a campus and create a new space. And we've had some other questions about how we can help change the population itself. How can we teach people to teach differently and to teach these students who are, as you say, agile?
It's really tough. And I mean, Rand is where I am right now doing this. It's a question of you go in and you are always trying. I've been doing little boot camps. I find that people where something resonates, I send things out to test. It's like fishing, right? You're going fishing. You send things out that the people that find it cool and interesting find you, and then you begin to work with them. And then hopefully they have a network. So I started with one person who believed in what I was doing in studios, and now we have about 3 dozen. It's fishing and catching the right fish who has a school of fish behind them, and little by little. It's not, there's no formula. You have to read, again, the context you're in. The culture is different everywhere.
It is. It is true. And the two of you know that better than most because of your experience in so many different learning cultures. Friends, I hate to pause here, but we are just past the end of our hour. We have shot past this time with incredible energy and passion. Let me first thank you both for a wonderful torrent of ideas and thoughts as well as inspiration. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, John. How can people keep up with you? I don't mean that psychologically. I mean, where can they keep up with your thinking and your work? What's the best way to do that?
JSB has a website. I don't have one yet, but
But you will very soon.
I've got lots of videos online. But Design Unbound is a little bit our manifesto, recognizing that a manifesto isn't a religious thing. It just means that it tries to be clear and articulate.
That's a nice thing to have. So we should be taking. So everybody, you can follow John on his website, and of course on Twitter. He's been tweeted at extensively in the past hour, and you have been tweeted at by name repeatedly in the past hour. If you would like to grab a copy of the book of the 2 volumes, you can grab them from our bookstore. So just go to brianalexander.org/bookstore or grab them from the MIT Press. In the meantime, let me just take a minute to explain what's happening over the next week with the forum. And let me thank you again, John, and thank you, Anne, so much. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's fun.
We have the next week, which is amazing to think about because we are just hurtling past at such speed. Let me thank you all as well for fantastic questions. I really, really appreciate where you took this conversation in very exciting and rich ways, very messy and entangled ways, making this a kind of architecture of conversation. Now, next week, you just saw Mark Prensky for a couple of minutes. He'll be our guest next week. Mark is well known for his work on games. He's well known as one of the first advocates of the digital natives idea. And he has a huge new project called Civilization Level Alternative Education. And you get to see it here first. So please come by next week for that. Our book club is about to announce our poll for our next book. So follow up for that. And of course, I mentioned the bookstore where you can find copies of these awesome tomes. And on top of that, if you want to keep talking after we stop talking out loud, head to social media. On Twitter, you can find us. We have groups on Slack, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and you can keep all this conversation going. Let me thank you all so much for your time and your energy and your thoughts. This has been a mind-expanding session. I'm grateful to have done that with all of you. Take care. Stay warm if you're in the North Country, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.